What is going on, snooker fans? Welcome back to the channel, and before we dive into this week's Snooker Digest episode, there was some very sad news that broke last night in the snooker world just after the final had finished, with word that we lost another snooker legend in Terry Griffiths, just a few months after the loss of another Welsh great of the game in Ray Reardon. Terry, of course, was not just a former world champion, but one of the very few men in the modern game to win the career Triple Crown, and he is also responsible for one of my favourite ever commentary moments, for a bit of a Freudian slip during that match between Judd and Robert in 2014. Of course, I was born well after his time at the top of the game, but I did grow up with him constantly on commentary for the BBC, so he did still in some way form a big part of my introduction to the sport as a youngster. So this is just incredibly sad news, and thoughts go out to his family and friends at this really difficult time. But now if we go into the snooker from last week, and it was a really good tournament, wasn't it? Perhaps not in terms of the standard of snooker, which was pretty low, particularly in the early rounds, but we still got plenty of drama and really close finishes. In the first round alone, we had 4 deciders and a further 7 matches that finished 6-4, and in fact, across the whole tournament, we had 9 final frame deciders, so even if the standard didn't quite hit the high levels that we might have expected, there was no shortage of drama, and the crowds in general would have definitely got their money's worth. And within all of that drama, there are plenty of talking points to go through as well. And I'll start first with a quick word on Neil Robertson, who I don't think got himself into Stephen Hendry's good books with his performance against Judd Trump in the opening round. There is of course no shame in losing to the best player in the world, but the manner of his performance did leave a lot to be desired in all truth. There were issues with the conditions, which is something that came up quite a few times over the course of the week. But even if the conditions had been perfect, I do think Neil still got in his own way a little bit. And we saw the way that Judd took control from 3-2 down proved that even if the conditions weren't great, if a player could just find a bit of fluency, they could have really taken charge of the match, and that's exactly what Judd Trump done. With Neil, he talks about trying to improve tactically to get himself back to the top of the sport, and whilst that is of course a really important feature of the modern game, he's going to need to find a way to strike that perfect balance between attack and defence, because there is no doubt he is a better player when he is more aggressive. And too often, in my opinion, he tried to play the containing safety rather than open up the reds in that match against Judd Trump. Now, of course, if Neil had won, then no one would be talking about this, but I do still think there's plenty for him to work on over the rest of the season if he wants to get himself a seeding for Sheffield. Something else that was pretty apparent to me last week was how seemingly reliant the BBC are becoming on using players who are currently playing in the event to do work on commentary and punditry alongside. Now, Sean Murphy in particular has gotten a lot of grief for continuing to commentate on events that he's still playing in. But last week we heard Mark Allen, who to be fair has done a lot of comms work recently as well, and then the likes of Kyren Wilson and Stuart Bingham, all commentating on matches when they were still in the tournament. Now, the insight that these current players bring to the comms box is definitely a breath of fresh air compared to the list of cliches that are rolled out by the current commentators. But the question is always going to be whether it's actually hindering them in the tournament. I don't think you would hear Judd Trump commentating unless he was knocked out early, and he of course is the benchmark of the sport at the moment. The players will know better themselves on what works best for them and what doesn't, and in fairness to Murphy, he did get very, very close to winning the world title in 2021, despite spending that entire tournament on commentary duty as well. However, from the perspective of an outsider, it has always seemed strange to me when players do this. And if the BBC is looking for a new commentator to freshen up their lineup, I do think they should be having a look at someone like Stephen Hallworth, who I thought done a really good job during the UK qualifiers. Back to what happened on the table though, and the reigning world champion had another strong week, getting to the semi-finals before being fairly comfortably beaten by the eventual champion, and he got there without really ever playing near his best, which is always a good sign as his superb first season as a world champion continues. And I did also want to spend some time talking about both Mark Selby and Ronnie O'Sullivan, because they've pretty much mirrored each other in the past couple of tournaments. Starting with O'Sullivan, of course he was 3-0 up against Zhao Anda in the Champion of Champions before losing 4-3, and he was then 3-1 and 4-2 up against Barry Hawkins last week, having made a couple of centuries before losing 6-4. Then looking at Selby, he too was 3-0 up against Zhao Anda before losing 6-5 at the Champion of Champions. And then last week he led Jack Lazowski 3-0, having made 2 centuries as well, and then went on to lose 6-4. Now on all 4 occasions, I don't actually think either player sort of threw their match away, Rather, their opponents just played very, very well to come back at them. But it is rare to see them, especially O'Sullivan, lose from such commanding positions 2 tournaments in a row. And then going back to Jack Lisowski, we've seen him play fantastic snooker many, many times before, but the way that he came back to beat Mark Selby could arguably be his best ever performance. He looked committed to the job, never gave in, and really competed with Mark in every single aspect of that game, which should be the most pleasing thing for him. However, as has become the case in so many times before, he couldn't convert a strong opening to a tournament into a title, as he ultimately lost to Mark Allen in the quarterfinals. And that brings me neatly on to Mark Allen, who, judging by the reactions that I've seen online, didn't exactly win over fans during his epic semi-final loss to Barry Hawkins. Now, the performance of Mark Allen was very similar to that of Neil Robertson, and you may wonder why I would get on Neil's back for playing the way that he did, and then not do the same for Mark Allen, but the reason is this: I think Neil has proved time and time again in the past that he is a much stronger player when he gets on the front foot and sees his average shot time in sort of the low to mid-20s. Mark Allen, on the other hand, has seen his game reach a whole different level since switching to a more measured, more methodical style of play. It didn't work out for him this time around, but his newfound ability of making himself incredibly difficult to beat is getting him into these kind of positions where he can challenge for the bigger titles on a more frequent basis. Michael Holt is also another man I wanted to highlight in this video too. Just seeing him get to the main venue was nice enough, with the 4 victories he secured at the qualifiers, but then he made it all the way through to his first quarterfinal of the UK Championship for 25 years, with wins over Kyren Wilson and Jack Jones. So that got him £25,000 in ranking points, which will be very, very useful as he looks to re-establish himself as a professional once again. And then also quickly before we get on to the 2 finalists, we also had a 147 made last week by Zhang Anda during his first round win over Li Pai Fan. And there's a really good video by Eurosport actually where O'Sullivan is basically marvelling over how good the break was. It was Zhang's 3rd maximum break of his career, and he followed that up by beating Bingham 6-5 from 5-1 down in the second round. So whilst he hasn't hit the insane heights of last season, he is still acquitting himself pretty well in my view as a top 16 player. But then on to the beaten finalist Barry Hawkins, and I say this with a tremendous amount of respect for Judd Trump, but I am slightly gutted that he didn't manage to get over the line last night. In addition to his losses at the 2013 World Championship final and both the 2016 and 2022 Masters finals, Hawkins has now completed the unwanted set of losing in a final of all 3 Triple Crown events and is still yet to pick up one. But looking past that agonising statistic, it was still a fantastic week for Hawkins, who got only his 3rd ever career victory over O'Sullivan in the first round, coming back from 4-2 down to win 6-4, and there was a slight fear that he wouldn't be able to kick on from that. But he'd put that to bed straight away with further wins over Dave Gilbert, Sean Murphy and Mark Allen to make it to his first UK final. And 2 of those wins over Gilbert and Mark Allen came in deciders as well. And you have to admire the way that he battled in the final yesterday. It was never going to be easy playing Judd Trump as it was, but his marathon semi-final didn't finish until just before 1 AM. So he was probably running on empty in that final and yet still pushed Judd all the way before narrowly losing out 10-8. It's impossible not to like Barry, and as I say, I was rooting for him, but given the circumstances, I don't think he could have done much more. He pinched a couple of frames in the first session to keep himself in it, and then started to get on a bit of a roll from 9-6 behind, but when you're playing someone like Judd, that was always going to be a very, very tough ask to come back. Still though, he's back in the top 16 for the Masters, and let's hope he gets at least one more crack at one of these major tournaments. But Judd Trump, what more is there to say about this guy? He is special. And whilst there will always probably be those naysayers about him who will jump on the fact that he's not won enough world titles, etc., the player that he has become over the past 6 years is up there with the kind of domination that the very, very best in the sport have produced. He is a winning machine, and there are times against Neil Robertson, times against John Higgins where it looked like he might be heading for an early exit. But the thing that is so admirable is his ability to stick around in matches, because if he can do that, there is every chance that he'll be able to click into gear. And that performance against Zhang Anda in the quarterfinals was up there with one of the best displays you'll ever see, making 4 centuries and scoring over 500 unanswered points in that match. He showcased every facet of his game last week, and he is just simply on another level. Now, I'm also not usually a fan of drawing comparisons between players, but what I will say is Judd is around the same age that O'Sullivan was back in 2012, and that was the year when O'Sullivan really started to become the ultimate winning machine. Of course, O'Sullivan was already a 3-times world champion by the age of 35, but since 2012 he went on to win a further 4 world titles, 4 Masters crowns and 3 UK titles in the space of 12 years. And with Judd now 35 years of age himself, I think it's very plausible that Judd could be on course to get very close to those kind of numbers as well, because it is very clear that he is now at the peak of his power and will be there for quite some time. And as I've already touched upon as well, he has an all-round game that makes him so difficult to beat. Things also seem to be very happy off the table as well for Judd, so everything really is falling into place. This of course isn't to say he won't suffer more disappointing losses at big tournaments along the way, of course he will, but the future is looking very promising if he can keep up this insane level of consistency and motivation. And that's it. I would say that's all the snooker until the new year, but there is still a crazy amount left to go between now and 2025. This week has the shootout, which particularly at this time of year is always a bit of light-hearted fun that we probably could all do with. Even if I do still very much object to the idea of it being a ranking event, I do have a lot of fun watching the tournament. Not only that, but we have the Scottish Open, the Invitational event out in Saudi Arabia is back, and also qualifiers for the German Masters, so if players were planning on taking it easy over the festive periods, they are going to have to think again. As for this channel, I'll be back to review the Scottish Open and have some further snooker related videos planned over the next couple of weeks. So if you are new around here, please do feel free to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming snooker content that you can watch with a mince pie and some mulled wine over the next few weeks.